Welcome to my official review about the Sony 50mm 1.4 G Master. This lens retails at the moment for $1,700. I got this as a compensation for my Canon RF 50mm 1.2 L lens. You would probably say, if you have already a 50mm 1.2 lens, why do you get a 50mm 1.4 lens as well? As you might know, the Canon version weighs almost a kilogram, which is like double the weight, which is almost double the weight that the EF version had, which is kind of strange. But by the time I got the 50mm lens, that was the only version which was out for the RF mount. If you like this video at the end, make sure to get this lens on my front store or using the link provided in the video description below. Now let's get started. The lens feels really good. So far for $1,700, it's an adequate haptic. With 520 grams, it's almost half light as my Canon version. At the same time, it measures 81 × 96 millimeters. For protecting your front element, I recommend a 67mm filter. It happened to me one day when my lens fell onto the front element, and that cost like half of the price that the lens retailed at this time. Make sure to get an ND filter at the same time, because you're not getting a lens with a super fast aperture, not to shoot wide open during daylight. I mean, if you're into photography, it sometimes really doesn't matter, but if you're into filming, you're restricted to some certain shutter speeds, and that's the reason why I can recommend an ND filter. The maximum aperture is 1.4 and the minimum aperture is 16. The focus ring feels really good for manual focusing, while there's also one aperture control ring that lets you control the aperture using your hand, or you leave it an A to control the aperture electronically using your camera's menu. There's also a click switch for the aperture control ring on the right side, while you have an AF/MS switch on the other side. There are two programmable buttons around the lens, which I didn't use so far. The lens hood is included, but there is no optical image stabilizer, while that has been done by the internal image stabilization of your Sony camera. It produces a really nice lens flare, by the way, and can be really pronounced while pointing the lens in an indirect angle to your light source. If you try to avoid the lens flare as much as possible, make sure to use the lens hood. While I would say there's also a huge advantage of having the lens flare, because if you have the sunset in the background and your model in the foreground with an external light source, it may look kind of amazing. This 1.4 aperture lens obviously produces some dark edges. So-called vignetting, especially pronounced if you are shooting at 1.4. However, it can be easily corrected using the automatic correction in Adobe Lightroom within a second. While we speak about the vignetting, let's have a look at the chromatic aberrations, which are also there, sometimes here and there a green or magenta shimmer, but this is easily handled using Adobe Lightroom. And it's not so pronounced as using the Sigma version for Sony with a 1.4 aperture. At the moment I have two lenses for my Sony α7 IV, the 20mm 1.8 G and this 50mm 1.4 G Master. My Sony α7 Mark IV tracks eyes so fast and precise, I was quite impressed. Even in low light it finds every eye using the correct settings. In photo mode I did have some problems using the very small focus field, often with no focus found, if I have kind of the same contrast in my image or in video. I tested the focus in a dark nightclub. Every now and then the focus didn't hit the target. However, I have to admit that in a nightclub you have a lot of different light scenarios all at the same time, from bright to very dark and back to very bright, so I wasn't wondering about that. However, a 50mm wouldn't be my first choice when it comes to nightclub photography, therefore I would rather go with a 35 or 24mm. However, this lens is just stunning if you plan to use it for festivals like I did in Frankfurt. There was a big festival which was already there for the 10th time. It's called World Club Dome. It's there for 3 days. During summer, it's next year, I think in September. And I was shooting a lot of portraits on that day and I was super happy with the performance at all. I used a larger focus field this time and it always tracked my subjects without any focusing issues at all. Let's speak about detail photography, because with this lens you can go as close as 41 centimeters in AF mode, and if you like to shoot in manual focus you can even get closer to 38 centimeters. So very close to all your subjects. I love to take detail shots with it, whether in nature, close-ups or for video. I get these kind of stunning shots. And as I said already, just take a slightly bigger focus field, not the small version using the manual focus field, which you can move all around your sensor and you don't have any issues when you get closer to your subjects. And if you want to convince yourself, I will upload some raw files for you to check them out at home in Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop. Where to use a fixed focal length such as the 50mm 1.4 G Master, obviously for portrait photography and filming. As I said a few moments ago, I was in a nightclub to take some photos of the people standing around with just using the ambient light over there, so I didn't use any flash, and sometimes it had some hard times to get the people in focus, whether it was the dancers which were constantly moving in changing lighting conditions. However, I would say out of 100 shots, 80 were in focus, even under these hard lighting conditions. Thanks to the super nice blur background, you get this stunning portrait look. Remember to use an ND filter if you want to film, or through the ND filter can also be useful for photography if you need to expose for a longer time. You get super sharp results, a fast focus, faces are always tracked. Especially during daylight, I didn't have any problems at all. Make sure to enable eye tracking, and if you're in AFC mode, which means continuous, you will see that you get stunning results and they're super sharp. The real strength of having a 50mm 1.4 G Master is of course its light intensity and of course its bokeh. 11 aperture blades create this nice round bokeh balls. Very nice to isolate your subjects or faces, or simply for details, like in the nature or for food, drinks and details. If you ask me, a 50mm belongs in every camera bag. I used it on a wedding and I got these stunning results. It's ideal for the church not to push the ISO too far, and it's also super nice if you want to capture some details at weddings or if you like to use it for filming on a gimbal. While the gimbal leads us into the next section, let's speak about video. Filmmakers get a quick focus, also in video mode. I definitely recommend an ND filter such as this one here, no matter if you're a photographer or a filmmaker. And for filmmakers, simply because you can expose longer. For instance, if you're standing in front of a waterfall or at a nice lake or sea with some waves and you want to have a really soft water, that's why you require an ND filter. Or if you just want to get rid of all the people standing in front of a busy road, like I did in New York one time when I was standing there having attached multiple ND filters on my lens just to get away with all the people on the Times Square because they were moving. I exposed a little longer, so I had less people on my image, just the ones that were sitting close by. And for filmmakers, it's such an important device because it lets you expose correctly even during bright daylight conditions. Because shooting at a 1.4 aperture and having moving subjects give you this kind of unusual look. So I'd rather use an ND filter, stop down to 100 or 200 of a second, having an aperture of 1.4, 1.8 or 2 to blur out the background or the foreground and keeping the ISO as low as possible. Or if you do color grading, keeping the natural ISO for S-Log. And since I'm in love with 50mm fixed focal length, I got it for myself and I'm using it to film a lot, especially details. Let's summarize here. For me, it was actually kind of a hard decision. Yes, I wanted to have the 50mm 1.4 version. However, it was kind of contradictory because I have already a 50mm 1.2 version for Canon. And some people might say, oh, well, that is a stupid idea to have like two 50mm versions for two different camera systems. But I would say no, I love my 50mm that I got for Canon, and since I got the 50mm for Sony, I'm not taking it too many times with me because the 50mm from Sony is like half the weight of the Canon version. So I needed it a bit more compact, and this lens is really compact compared to its strength, which is the 1.4 aperture, which lets me create such a nice blur background or foreground, depends where your focus point is. There's also a 1.8 version out on the market for the last, I think, 5 or 6 years, which I'm not interested at all. And to be honest, I do not regret the purchase. It's very light, not too front heavy on my Sony Alpha 7 Mark IV. It does feature a fast autofocus system in combination with this camera. The photos are absolutely sharp and I have nothing to complain even at an aperture of 1.4. Here and there a green and magenta shimmer, but that can be seen quite rarely on any photo. The bokeh speaks for itself, and thanks to the low closest focusing distance, this lens is super nice for food and details. And obviously the real strength is portrait photography. If this video was helpful to you, make sure to subscribe, thumbs up, and you will find this link on my front store. Now I'm happy to hear your thoughts about this lens. Are you using this lens yourself? Do you have 2 camera systems? And on which camera are you using this lens already, or do you have the 1.2 version? See you next time und tschüss.